All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Stimson Center, and a special welcome to new friends and old friends, but especially our speakers. Jeff Opperman and Jorge Gastelumendi,
There you go.
is it close?
Yeah.
Okay. Are now old friends of ours, as well as several others from the Nature Conservancy in the audience. This is the first time we've had a program on Myanmar, which is really exciting because it's sort of potentially parallels the kind of work we've been doing in the Mekong, and the issues are definitely very similar. Jeff and Jorge and others at the Nature Center, the Nature Conservancy, have been working on this issue of scalable. We're talking scalable system scale planning, and it's a very interesting concept because it addresses one of the obvious things is, well, if you're going to dam a river or use a river to generate hydropower energy, well, obviously you want to look at it from a system scale, but in fact that's not what happens. And so they've been working first in South America on this issue, and what they're going to be talking about today is it's one tool of many that are needed to do sustainable energy, whether hydro or other. And of course, it's also focused on one source, hydro. And the most obvious reason is that there will be hydro. So the question is, how many, which ones, what kind of mix of hydro, other energy sources, transmission, demand management. There's all these other things that are out there, but for starters, the reality is that on the Mekong, for instance, you've got just on the mainstream alone, you got 11 proposed dams, mainstream dams, big dams, except for one, which is big damage, but not as big as the others, and they're all concessions. They're all commercial concessions. The locations were laid out actually by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps of Engineers and the folks from the Tennessee Valley Authority and Columbia River in the early days after World War II. So it isn't rocket science that where can you find the best hydro heads, for instance? Where can you generate the most power, and what's the best combination of power? But those folks were plumbers. I mean, they were looking strictly at the hydrology, how much power can you get out of the river, where should you put the dams. No understanding of the ecology of the river, no understanding of the importance of fish, for instance, or sediment flows, deltas, sediment, but hardly anything has changed since then. I mean, and the Mekong is 11 proposals, 2 of which are already underway, but from 4 or 5 companies from 4 or 5 or 6 countries, and they're all independent concession, build, own, operate, transfer, or build, operate, transfer, and there's no. People talk about the nexus. There's no scale planning, basin scale planning going on right now, even just for hydro alone. So this is a really important topic, and but I emphasize that, and it's something dear to our hearts because we have a sort of a parallel approach to the Mekong, which is somewhat different. That is, we totally accept this idea of basin scale planning, but we also think there's another reality here that maybe we can talk about briefly in discussion afterwards, and that is that yes, there will be hydro, but in fact there are also other issues about hydro, And in some ways, these dam projects, the big dam projects, are looking increasingly problematical. Rising financial risk, especially, rising political risk, climate change impacts. Look at the drought in Southeast Asia and the Mekong right now, and what that does to efficiency of hydropower dams, et cetera. So I won't go on any more than that. But let me just mention I think we have a handout, do we?
Yes, we have the
Bios, okay. So I won't dig deeply into the bios, but both Jeff and Jorge have impressive backgrounds and experience in these hydropower issues as well as legal issues in Jorge's case, and maybe yours too. Huh?
Not legal too
Not
much.
you, okay.
No.
Okay, but anyway, I don't want to hold us back from getting on with the program, but again, welcome everybody to the Stimson Center. We're a nonprofit, definitely non-government think tank. We emphasize practical approaches to very difficult problems, particularly that have lots of political and economic, financial, et cetera, social parameter or components. And so we're delighted to sort of reach out now towards the Mekong. And we've been talking to our friends at Nature Conservancy for some months now about even doing some things together, starting with, well, not starting with this, because Jeff was a commentator several months ago. We had a program on our sort of idea on the Mekong, is this idea of a new narrative. That is, just because you build 2 dams and because the MRC doesn't work very well, if at all, and it looks like there's nothing to stop these things, but in fact, we believe with our new narrative, in fact, that there are lots of obstacles rising, particularly rising political and financial risk, and so all these dams are not going to be built. So, and we're pretty confident of that, and so are a lot of other people we've talked to at a very high level in the Lao government or in the Mekong River Commission. And then the question becomes, all right, well, which ones? What combination of dams? And so even whether we're talking about a major tributary of a big tributary of the Irrawaddy River or the Mekong or other rivers, what's planned is probably not all going to be developed, and that especially then raises the question of, okay, then which ones, and how can you optimize optimize the trade-offs on the basin scale, energy, food security, water, use of water, et cetera. So, Jeff?
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. Great to be here. As Richard mentioned, we've been working increasingly closely with the Stimson Center and learning about their programs and finding that we have a lot of overlap in our objectives and how we think about things. And so we're hoping to continue collaborating with the Stimson Center and sharing ideas. For this project, I want to thank this was funded by the UK's Department for International Development, DFID. It was in collaboration with WWF and the University of Manchester, so a whole broad range of people helped contribute to this work. And you'll see an interesting part of this is that because it was funded from DFID, they challenged us to explore this idea of system scale planning that Richard was mentioning, but to explore it in a broader context than from our own organization's primary interest. So we're a conservation organization, the Nature Conservancy. We're focused on protecting land and waters and the people that depend on natural systems. But DFID was saying, DFID, we're focused on broad development benefits. And we hear you saying that you think that system planning offers a better deal for countries. And they said, well, let's explore that idea. Let's not have the primary focus be on conservation. We want to have the primary focus on the issues that governments are most likely to care about. Because we acknowledge that governments are probably not going to care that much about concepts like free-flowing rivers, environmental flows, and they may not even care all that much about fisheries. At some level they will, but they're going to be driven by a pretty specific set of development imperatives. And so the idea that system scale planning can actually help them make better decisions across a range of values and deliver the best outcomes for their citizens is really the premise behind this work. And so we kind of approach the conservation aspects as a little bit like the way you could slip some kale into a smoothie that you give to your kids. You know, it's there, but it's not going to be the primary focus.
It's still green though.
Yeah, it's still green. And so at the heart of this is the idea of system scale planning and how system scale planning can address many of the challenges that confront hydropower development. And so, as I was saying, this is not just the conservation challenges about hydropower development, but it's just how do countries deliver effective systems of infrastructure that benefit their people broadly. So looking at the big picture here, so this is a map of dams around the world. The blue dams are existing. The orange dams are hydropower dams that are under construction, and the red dams are hydropower dams that are planned. And so you can see that, and here's, doesn't really show up. There's Myanmar, basically. So a lot of red dots. It's right up there with the Himalayan arc, parts of the Andean Amazon, West Africa, and Southeast Asia in general are the places that are under extreme pressure for hydropower development. They also happen to be the places that have the most diverse freshwater ecosystems in terms of fish and other species. That's what this map shows. The darker colors are the richness of species. What this map doesn't show, but essentially follows the same trend or the same pattern, is the degree to which rural populations depend directly on functioning rivers. So particularly in Southeast Asia, we have countries like Cambodia, like Myanmar, where freshwater fish harvests represents the dominant part of the national protein intake. So these are places where the idea of ecosystem services is not an abstract notion, but in fact, it's an incredibly important part of the national food supply. But this shows that hydropower is projected to approximately double around the world in the next 35 years, meaning there will be about as many dams built in the next 3.5 decades as were built in the previous century. So that represents a huge challenge, and the challenge ultimately is, as Richard said, hydropower is coming. It's going to continue to be developed for a variety of reasons, including the drive for low carbon energy. So if hydropower is coming, how can we do it better? And how can countries plot a course that's going to deliver broader benefits for their people? That was the heart of what we're trying to do. So why is system scale planning of hydropower important? Well, the point that I'll be making here is that the current way of delivering hydropower leaves a lot of opportunities unmet. It causes a lot of problems, not just for conservation, but for really how the system can work more efficiently. In countries like Myanmar, hydropower is currently developed essentially one project at a time, as Richard was describing about in the Mekong. It's very similar. It's a developer-led process, and so developers understandably have a much narrower vision than a government would have in terms of which project you build next. Developers can be thinking about really only about the sites that they have access to and trying to figure out how they can maximize their value out of those sites. And the approach to mitigation is generally the assumption that whatever impacts we may have at this site, they are able to be mitigated. But that's missing a lot of the big picture. And the big picture is that when a country has reached its development build-out, it will have a system of dams. But it may be a system in name only. It may be a system of projects that simply emerged through random individual decisions along the way, as opposed to being a system that was designed from the very beginning. And so a developer-led single project approach, it misses out on cumulative impacts. That's an environmental and a social concern, but it also misses out on simply how can a system effectively work together to deliver water and energy benefits to a country. And systems that evolve haphazardly oftentimes miss those opportunities for synergistic management, for coordinated management. Sometimes projects, including in the Mekong Basin, projects actually interfere with each other. So a project built a decade later will then change the flow that an earlier project was predicated upon. and causing the need for these projects to try to work it out afterward, but clearly not a very efficient way. And also developers will tend to build what they can build. And it's interesting to hear this from an environmental perspective, but it may be that a developer misses an opportunity by building a smaller project at a site because that's all they can get financing for, when that site was actually much more appropriate for a far bigger dam. But maybe that far bigger dam would mean that 3 other dams don't need to get built. But because a smaller project was built at that site, it precludes the ability to build the right dam, and therefore that affects the whole system going forward. So these are the challenges, and they manifest in a set of conflicts often. So environmental conflicts, and in Myanmar, a lot of social conflicts. So people felt that projects were being built with a narrow set of priorities to benefit a narrow set of beneficiaries, and there's been consistent conflict around hydropower development. And so not only is this approach leading to bigger impacts, but it winds up not even delivering the energy that is needed because projects get bogged down in uncertainty and controversy, including, for example, the Mission project on the Irrawaddy River, which was suspended after hundreds of millions of dollars had been invested. So a huge investment. It was suspended, and it's still a very sore point between the countries of China and Myanmar, and there's still uncertainty about it. But clearly not a strategic way to build an energy system. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is this idea that when a country finally has a collection of dams, that is a system. Whether it was intended to be a system or it just emerged is really the question. Is it a system that works well together? And this, you'll see several plots like this, and this is this report that we wrote for DFID, really used this framework of visualizing trade-offs between different values, with the idea being that we need to understand all the different values that are going to be affected by a set of investment decisions, and be able to track them and be able to show what are the trade-offs between things so that governments and people can make good choices. So this is a simple, essentially a conceptual diagram showing the trade-off between environmental performance and hydropower generation. Every dot represents a set of investment decisions. So a combination of different dams, different size dams at those sites, and different operations of those dams. So how the dams store and release water over time. So each dot is a different combination. The black dots form what is called the Pareto optimal frontier. So the black dots represent an investment option that cannot be improved in one direction without hurting the other direction. So if you're in any of these gray dots, you could always, see if you're at this gray dot, you could always improve your environmental performance without having any effect on hydropower. So in a sense, this is not a rational choice. You would never choose this because you could get so much more without any trade-off. The Pareto frontier represents where any choice to try to get better on one comes at the cost of the other. Now, just because it's Pareto optimal doesn't mean it's balanced, because, for example, this one is the pure hydro generation with really poor environmental performance, but it still means that you cannot improve one without costing the other. So this is going to be an important thing as we look at some of the results here. And so we were trying to propose a framework in this report that would show how a country could build a decision-making framework that relies on this kind of analysis across many variables, and importantly, not just analysis, but visualization in a way that would allow stakeholders to actually see what are the trade-offs.
Excuse me, Jeff, could you tell us, so is this hypothetical, or how much is it?
This one's hypothetical. This one's hypothetical. In a sense, it's just to illustrate what a Pareto frontier is and what a constellation of these dots represent. But in just a moment, I'll show the actual thing that we did. And one other notion that's common in these sort of trade-off analyses is that there's a tipping point, at which point a relatively small increase in one metric comes at increasingly steep cost at the other. Meaning if you get to this point, along here, you have interesting choices to make between environmental performance and hydropower. Once you get from here to increase hydropower even slightly, you're more or less going off a cliff of environmental performance. And this actually often appears in real data, where if you just had a straight line, then you just have a pure trade-off, and it's just a question of values. Where along that trade-off would you like to be? When there's a tipping point, there's often a way to argue that it wouldn't really make sense to go much further, because for a 5% gain in one value, you're having a 50% loss in the other. It becomes increasingly obvious of how to achieve something more like a balance. So water resources in Myanmar. Myanmar is blessed with lots of water. I think per capita they have about double the water of the United States, and per capita they have about 8 times the water of China. The Irrawaddy and the Salween are 2 of the longest free-flowing rivers that remain free-flowing in the world. And these rivers, particularly the Irrawaddy, are very important for navigation. It's the primary way that goods move throughout the country. The Irrawaddy is also very important for irrigation. So Myanmar is a bit drier than the rest of Southeast Asia. It relies on irrigation quite a bit more than does Thailand or Cambodia. So irrigation is an important value. And with that monsoon pattern, there are flooding risks to certain of the urban areas. So flooding and flood risk management is a key issue in Myanmar as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, fisheries are an incredibly important resource. So Myanmar ranks 4th in the world in terms of freshwater fish harvest. And it's by far the most important source of protein in the national diet. Capture fisheries, wild fish harvest from the rivers. Water resources and hydropower. So Myanmar has the energy profile more consistent with African countries. In terms of its neighbors, it lags far behind in terms of per capita energy demand or energy consumption. For example, Vietnam is about 8 times greater in terms of energy consumption. Only 1/3 of the population has access to electricity. So that is much more like many countries in Africa in terms of that kind of shockingly high lack of access to electricity. Most of their current electricity supply is from hydropower. So they already are fairly dependent on hydropower. And they have 100 gigawatts of potential, of technically potential, not necessarily economically feasible, but 100 gigawatts. So it's a huge amount. And I believe that that represents dramatically more than even the fairly optimistic predictions of what the energy demand will be in 25 years. So what's nice about this from a system scale perspective is they actually have lots of options. They have far more potential than they have demand. Now, complicating this a bit is that export of energy is a real potential resource for Myanmar. So selling it to Thailand, selling electricity to China, India, or Bangladesh, all those countries are exploring investments in Myanmar that would be similar to what Richard would describe for Laos. It's projects that are driven primarily for export. And that sets something of a different dynamic, but essentially you can put that into the same system scale planning framework. So the map here shows the projects that are existing, under construction, and planned. And you can see that most of them fall into that category of being planned. So for our work, the work that we did for DFID, it was a relatively short process. We only had a few months actually to do this research. So what we intended to do is to come up with a conceptual or an illustrative framework for how a system scale decision-making process could work and what the value of that would be, what the benefits to a decision maker in a country would be, or to funders of a country would be. And actually, what would be the benefit for developers as well? And I didn't mention this in the introductory slide, but all that uncertainty, like with Mission, the canceled projects and conflicts and delay, all that uncertainty does not actually work well for developers either. So for developers and the investors that fund them, that kind of uncertainty is not great from an investment perspective. So that is one other aspect of system scale planning, is that a well-designed system should be producing a set of projects that have lower conflict and therefore should be more investable, more bankable. So we did not have the time to try to design a system scale approach or to illustrate a system scale approach for the entire country or even for the entire Irrawaddy. So we needed to illustrate this, to illustrate the basic principles of what system scale approaches are and what the value of a system scale approach is. So we did that by looking at a tributary of the Irrawaddy called the Mitnye. What is it called?
Mitnye. It means little river.
Mitnye. Yeah, Little River, but it's actually one of the bigger tributaries of the Irrawaddy. And it's essentially just a 5-dam cascade. So it's a simplified version of a much bigger problem of options. Because as you move into looking at the whole country or a whole large river basin with a potential dam inventory of 30 or 50, then the number of permutations there rapidly rises into the millions. Now, it's actually quite possible to do with the same models that we were applying, but it's harder it takes much longer to assemble the data, much longer to do the analysis. So we needed to do something that was bite-sized. So there's a total of 5 dams in this river basin. Only one that exists, and it's currently the biggest hydropower dam in Myanmar. So it's the most important source of electricity in Myanmar right now, and that's the Yewa. And then the upper Yewa is currently under construction. The other dams are planned with some activity going on in terms of feasibility, but there still remains flexibility, meaning there could be different size dams built at those sites. So we were able to build a model that looked at all the possible combinations of building dams, including not building any further dams, just the one remaining dam, or the one existing dam. And then different combinations of which dams were chosen and which dams were not built, which sizes of dams, and then different operating schemes. And so there was a water management model built into the heart of this, where water is routed through whatever dams are put into that run of the model. And the reservoir has a certain size and a certain ability to manage water. And the model essentially looks for operating patterns that meet the objectives. And I'll get to the objectives right now. So we looked at these 10 metrics. We chose 10 metrics that have value for stakeholders and have value for the government. And as you see, I mean, there are some of those, the conservation kale that we're slipping in there. But as I was mentioning before, the fisheries is clearly an important development and human health and well-being variable. Even if countries in the Mekong do not seem to be acknowledging the value of their own fisheries. But clearly it's something that there are stakeholders for, there are advocates for, and it needs to be something that countries consider as they make development choices. So these are the 10 metrics that the model was tracking and the model was trying to solve. So the model is looking at all those investment choices, which dam, what size, what operating mode, and trying to solve to achieve these objectives. And you see some it was trying to maximize and some it was trying to minimize. So the algorithms built into the model are trying to find solutions that meet these various things and looking at hundreds and hundreds of possible solutions. And then they form a 10-dimensional cloud version of that simple version I showed you before. So we cannot show you the 10-dimensional cloud, but it's out there. What?
Yeah, it's possible.
It's yeah, but it's very hard to visualize. What we wind up doing, and this model is intended to walk stakeholders through a set of trade-off curves where you begin to explore, for example, fish against hydropower, and you explore it and you look for potential combinations, investment combinations that look promising, and then you begin to bring in additional metrics and you explore how those change your perceptions. And you could do this over and over, and it's an iterative process that eventually can identify a set of projects where the trade-offs are very clear and where stakeholders can make various recommendations on. What we proposed here we did not make recommendations. We were not in the business of telling Myanmar which dams to build and which not to build. At this stage, we were in the business of showing them that trade-offs could be made very visible, that you could go from a black box decision-making approach to a very transparent decision-making approach, and that when stakeholders would have the ability to see trade-offs and see how small gains in one or small losses in one metric might correspond with high gains in another metric, that those solutions might appear to be quite promising and therefore get broad support. So here's a situation where we're looking at generation versus fisheries. Now, the upper right is the ideal. That would be where you get the most generation and the most fish. But almost in any of these trade-offs, that's not going to be possible. You're always looking at something that represents losses in one value. Now, there's a very few dots here because these are the only dots, these are the only combinations of investments out of the hundreds of combinations that actually are on the Pareto frontier just for these two. So there's a whole bunch of other things, but they fall somewhere in here, meaning you would never pick one of these projects because you could always move up to here or out to here. So these represent if you were only caring about fish and energy, these represent the rational and the Pareto optimal choices. And so you might look therefore at an inflection point, E, where any further increase in energy, and it's very slight, leads to a dramatic decline in fish. Meaning, if you were trying to find balance, it would not make sense to go to this combination because you've increased just a couple % of your energy and had a dramatic decline in your fish.
I'm sorry, would you clarify though? So when you say mean annual generation, gigawatts, and so you've got 3-4 dams stacked, more or less there. They're all at the 4,700 or whatever level. I don't understand.
So these are probably different. These are not just.
You're saying you're not getting any more. Sorry. Looks like one dam develops all the power of 5 dams or 6.
Right. There's actually combinations here that have less energy, but they don't do as well for fish, and so it actually pushes you. Here, I'll just do a little preview. There's a bunch more combinations, but the previous slide is only showing this Pareto frontier.
Okay.
This is the only thing that matters when you initially are comparing two trade-offs.
Sorry, if I missed it, the combinations and all the different factors that make up that previous slide that you had up there for the colorful one.
Yeah.
Do you have a list of sort of what those various?
Right. So each dot is a different set of dams or a different set of operations. So you can see here that these are probably all represent. Well, I'll get ahead of myself. Let me go back for a second. So these dots don't represent individual dams. These dots represent different combinations of dams. So you would look up and say, E, oh, that's build 3 out of the 5 dams and operate it this way. And then the reason that they're all so close is they probably represent building the same dams but operating them differently. So what it's saying is that this choice would be a good choice because it's a set of dams that provides very similar energy, but when you operate it this way, you get a lot more fish benefit.
And do you include design elements or features as part of the operations or components?
Different sizes.
Okay.
It wasn't all that sophisticated. They were really just like big or small. You could certainly, if you had more information, you could get a lot more sophisticated in design plus operation. Yeah, but operation is you store it into March and then you begin to release it. Those things. So the fisheries value includes the flow regime. So different ways of operating the reservoirs are going to affect the fish differently. So that's why. Now, looking at the inflection point, you might say E is the best combination. But now we're going to add in one more variable, and that's the investment cost. So that was not reflected in the previous. The previous one is just showing the trade-off between fish and energy. Now we're adding in one more way of looking at trade-offs, and it's investment costs. And you can do this. You could then look at navigation. You could then look at flood management. But here's a very obvious one, which is what are the costs of these different options? Okay, and E was looking to be very good because where it stood in that trade-off curve, E happens to be the most expensive option possible. Okay, so now E is not looking quite so good. But if you notice, now that we have added additional metrics, we're now seeing combinations that are not on that Pareto frontier. They're just off the frontier. So for example, D didn't show up before because it's not Pareto optimal from only the perspective of 2 metrics, but when you throw in cost, now it is. And you see option D is actually one of the cheaper options. And it produces just slightly less energy than E, and it's actually slightly better for fish. Now, the main takeaway point, and I know this, I got way into the weeds here and what this is, and really the point isn't so much to be focused on, well, what is that combination of dams and let's go build it. It's to say that option D is a potentially really intriguing option for Myanmar to consider, but it could have never emerged through a series of individual proposals. There'd be no way to get to option D. I mean, you possibly could, but it's a little bit like the monkeys typing out Hamlet, if you get enough monkeys in the room. So the option D as a well-balanced scenario that provides almost as much energy as your best solution, almost as much fish support as your best solution, coming in at a relatively low cost. Then maybe you look at navigation, you look at a few other trade-offs. But this kind of specific combination of site design and operation would not emerge through individual projects. In fact, as soon as you build one or two, you have probably closed off most of your other options. And so, and what this research also shows is that the earlier you begin this process, the more you give yourself actually a blank canvas to identify a well-balanced solution like D. And as soon as you make a few decisions, like is happening on the main stem Mekong, every month, every year that goes by in the main stem Mekong, or the Mekong in general, really promising options are being closed off.
Right.
There remain good options, but your best options have probably been compromised.
Thank you, Jorge. This is just an observation, and I think you can confirm or correct it, you may. So I think you mentioned a while ago that visualization is really important in trade-off discussions, and I agree with that. And you did mention also that point D is actually a balanced solution. It's not in the trade-off frontier. But in fact, if we have the ability to visualize in 3D, 4D, 5D, it's actually probably part of the Pareto surface.
It is. No, you're exactly right. I should say it was not part of the
two-dimensional.
The two-dimensional Pareto, but it's part of that 10-dimensional Pareto. It is. Yes. You're exactly right.
By the way, if you would identify yourselves when you ask a question. Julian Castanov from State.
Yeah, my name is Henry Manguera. I'm an independent consultant after working for more than 15 years in Tech as well as in Microwave International. I just got back from the Mekong region. I used to be the council study coordinator. You probably heard of the council study.
I haven't, but
At the Mekong River Commission.
okay, good, good.
We can talk more about it later.
So that I realize that this is a bit complicated, but again, the whole idea being that a system scale approach upfront can identify a set of investment choices that would be very difficult to ever emerge through individual actions, and that a country would be able to look at these different options, understand the trade-offs between them, and make choices that are in the best interest of the country overall. And that could be for conservation perspectives, could be for fisheries. I mean, a country, if they chose, could just do navigation and hydropower. But I mean, obviously at this point, it then becomes a question of values and stakeholders beginning to request and push for different outcomes. But at least the information is there and the understanding of trade-offs is there. And if a country made a choice that was in a pretty crazy part of this decision space, they would have to defend why they made a decision when clearly there were better options. And we did look at a few analyses at the scale of the Irrawaddy Basin. So the Mitnyay is a major tributary, but it's relatively small. The Irrawaddy represents a major portion of the whole country of Myanmar. And similar to the Mekong, it has a lot of the fish are long-distance migrants. So the fishery is very dependent on there being connected river for fish to move up and down different times of the year for spawning, for rearing. So we wanted to let's look at all the ways that you could build hydropower in the overall Irrawaddy and how would that affect free-flowing river, a river that's available for migratory fish. So again, each dot represents a different combination of dams. Now, here we don't have design and we don't have operation because we're working at the bigger scale. Here it's just simply the spatial distribution of dams, whether they're built or not built, adding up their energy potential as a percent of total. So 100% is building every dam in the dam inventory. Down here is just the baseline. This is how much has already been built. And then each blue dot shows how much migratory fish habitat is being affected. So win-win solutions can be found, for example, because this dot here is developing 65% of the total capacity, which would be far more than is projected to be needed in the next several decades. But the increase in affected kilometers is only from 4,000 to about 4,500. But a different set of choices, and that could be a dramatically, thousands or at least 1,000 kilometers more of impact for the same amount of energy. Similarly, if a lower amount was built, there's a broad range in how much migratory fish habitat would be affected for the same amount of energy. And again, just like I was explaining before, there's essentially a Pareto trade-off curve where you would follow this low end, because if you were only caring about kilometers of impacted habitat and hydropower, you would choose to be somewhere along the red dots, and then it becomes a question of trade-offs. Where do you want to go? How much energy? How much fish? But you would always want to be along this lower edge. Now, as soon as you add in cost, that begins to change too. But just looking at this at a very basic sense, the take-home message of this is even at the scale of the Irrawaddy, there are options. And there's options where Myanmar could build a fairly decent amount of the energy potential that's out there with minimizing the impacts on migratory fish.
I'm Sheridan from the Blue Moon Fund, and so far we've mostly been talking about hydropower potential, and I don't think you can necessarily, or maybe you can't, I don't know, but there hasn't really been talk about the practicality of it in terms of, Myanmar's power grid is pretty dismal. So even if you can get like 80 or 90% of hydropower potential, it can't really work with the national grid. So has there been any discussion at this stage about also working to improve the electrical grid in Myanmar as well?
Yeah, I think that currently the World Bank and IFC are both investing in strategic environmental assessments for the country or for the Irrawaddy, looking at energy expansion, and undoubtedly looking at the grid and how that can absorb the energy would be part of that. And it certainly would need to be factored in for any of the investment costs that are being considered for different options. And it'll be another, well, when you break down the investment cost of dam A versus dam B, the cost of connecting it to the grid is built into the cost. Okay. That's the total cost of a dam. Mm-hmm. So when we get those economic values for the cost of dams, it's considering grid hookup as part of that cost. Yeah.
Just actually, I was going to mention this later if the appropriate time came along, but JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, has recently released a big study they did on looking at a whole scheme, power scheme for Myanmar, including sources, not just hydro, but coal and other thermal, et cetera, gas, and transmission lines, the grid. They've got this whole thing. And what's interesting about it, just very briefly, is that they have three options or scenarios. And in one scenario, the favored one minimizes the number of big hydro dams, so they justify that on environmental and socioeconomic impact grounds. But at the same time, that also favors clean coal, which is obviously what they're selling. But still, the thing is that they've done the whole Myanmar cut, and they are looking at trade-offs, but obviously in a very different and probably not as scientific way as you are.
My understanding too is that they're renewing that plan.
Pardon?
My understanding is that they're going to renew and redo that plan.
Redo it, okay.
I think that one was done a couple of years ago, and just given the change in the political climate, they're going to go back and do some more master planning. So that's in the pipeline.
Okay, implications for Myanmar, just to sum up here, that this basic approach, so the Nature Conservancy has referred to it as hydropower by design. We have a report here called The Power of Rivers that goes into what that means, hydropower by design. But essentially it's this, I've been describing, it's this system scale approach, showing the trade-offs, identifying how system scale planning can actually identify better development options. that can meet energy goals for lower impacts. That given the climate right now for investment in hydropower in Myanmar, that a good system scale approach would actually be better for the developers and for the funders of development. So this should be a case where we could align the advocates of strategic planning, which are often people who are focused on governance or dam affected people or conservation, but align their motivation for system scale planning with that of the developers. Because if they're faced with a very uncertain investment climate, they should be looking for the kind of certainty that would come with this approach. And the newly elected government of Myanmar, the National League for Democracy, is that it? NLD? National League for Democracy? Probably more so than almost any other time that I can think of, they actually talked about hydropower in their campaigns. They pointed to hydropower as being environmentally and socially problematic, and saying that they were going to take a fresh look at hydropower. And that was part of their manifesto of their election campaign. So they essentially are coming in with a mandate to do hydropower better, or to take a fresh look at hydropower. So proposing a system scale approach where individual projects are going to be assessed in light of how they fit in with an overall system. They have a mandate to do something like that. And the backdrop here is there are all those existing red dots, all those red triangles on that map. Those are places that represent MOUs or initial studies. They represent developers with specific interests that will need to be addressed. Because if every single one of those commitments is just simply followed through on, then there's no point in system planning, because just simply you'll just, but Myanmar recognizes that, and those are options that they can revisit. So this is an interesting time for them. They have the ability to think about a different way for doing hydropower. And as I was saying, World Bank, IFC, others are investing in strategic planning. So there's a convergence of interest, of politics, of funding, and in a variety of stakeholders that are urging this to happen. And in fact, we think it would create a better climate for developers and investors to plan energy in Myanmar. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up, and Jorge is going to talk more broadly about how the Nature Conservancy is looking at the kinds of mechanisms that can get this kind of planning actually underway. So this was an R&D showing a basic illustrative framework for why it has value. But for a country to actually adopt it, there has to be a structure, there has to be policies, there has to be incentives, and Jorge is going to touch on that.
Thanks, Jeff. So yes, in addition to the kind of information and technological sort of technical decision-making tools that you can develop, and there are plenty of those. TNC has developed this. A country to actually move forward with applying this kind of system scale planning, they need also political leadership. And I think, and I do believe that around this table, there are plenty of institutions that are looking into that and supporting that throughout the Mekong. But also you need capacity, and you need, aligned to that, you need financial resources. And so if you have a combination of those three factors, technical support, financial resources, and political leadership or will, then you might have a chance to actually make these kind of things happen. And so, yes.
Yeah, if I may, because I have a question actually, and this could be a good segue.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can address in your talk, because we're going to be talking more globally. And I'm happy to hear that this system scale approach, this framework, is going to be available to Myanmar. As you said, I think the timing is perfect because it's new government. There's real positive energy there. All the development partners, including those from the Mekong region, are moving to Myanmar.
Yeah.
By and large, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the water resources in Myanmar are pretty much within Myanmar.
Mm-hmm.
Who's in point around with
Well, the Irrawaddy in particular is essentially
you have
one country. Yeah.
You have the other long watershed that touches China and Thailand and Myanmar. And so what I'm trying to say is, I think the likelihood for the system scale planning approach to be implemented, to be adopted, and make a difference is really high, relatively speaking. And I'm saying that because in the Mekong region, it's a lot more complicated. You know, I worked again with the Mekong River Commission for 1.5 years as an independent consultant, and I was coordinating one of the most important studies on sustainable design and management of water resources developments, including the mainstream dams. And I'm actually kind of disappointed that you haven't heard of that study, but I think Richard and others have, you know. But anyway, but the problem is much more complicated. And in fact, they're actually doing some system scale planning. They don't use that word. Maybe too late, but it's never too late to do system scale planning, right? They've been doing sustainable hydropower and so on and so on. They're using different set of terms. But the real issue is that you're dealing with 4 governments. That doesn't even include China. That has unilaterally constructed 6 or 7 dams already in upstream Mekong. You're dealing basically, so to come up with an integrated, basin-wide, sustainable development alternatives, set of development alternatives, it has to really be reconciled with the national interests and needs and politics of the 4 countries. And so that's the main issue. So the question, I guess, for you and for is, can this approach be adapted in situations where there is transboundary water is involved? And what kind of maybe additional customizations need to be included to be able to effectively apply in those situations?
Well, yeah, great question. Obviously, anything that involves transboundary is going to be far more complicated than dealing with a single government. But Jorge, I think this will be something that when Jorge will talk about some of these structures, some of the examples, and then we can, in the discussion, think about how they might be able to be, how they might translate to a transboundary setting.
Yeah, and certainly I will love Rich's contribution to that question, because I do know for a fact that you've been looking into that as well.
Well, it's interesting that the transboundary factor is really important, as you say. But at the same time, if we get beyond just the dams but get to grids, if Laos had a national grid or north-south trunk line that connected smaller grids, that could be bilateral aid to one country. And then they sell the power through bilateral arrangements with their neighbors. And so they could also have as much or more power for export with fewer dams. So it's a similar idea, but then you're looking at grids rather than just the dams themselves. Carl Jackson.
Carl Jackson says you might want to throw one other factor in. While there might not be as much of a transnational problem, there is the problem of this country, Myanmar, having more rebellions in it than any other country on the face of the earth. And some of the developers who are working on dams are directly negotiating with rebels, because that's the only way to build a dam. And that's with the knowledge of the governments. This is a very dicey thing. I've heard the dams are vulnerable.
They are.
So with that,
sorry, sorry, Jorge. Go ahead.
So I'll. This is what is. I don't know if the chart is fine or not. Maybe I lost something here. But the main point in this slide and the next slide is that there is with the Paris Agreement and with a lot of discussions around climate change, there is a push for increasing the amount of renewable energies around the world to actually deal with the greenhouse gas emissions increase. And so, in addition to the appetite for, in particular countries, to actually develop hydropower as a use of a direct source that they have in hand, there's also a push, macro push, to look into renewable energies, being hydro one of those, but also solar, and also wind and geothermal and others. So there is a sort of a global stage that is moving countries into looking into these opportunities, and that increased investment is going to bring a lot of disruptions in terms of both social and environmental issues. And so that is a reality that we need to take to be aware of. It's not only a political reality at a country level, but also there is a global push for that. And if we see how, well, this chart is kind of moved around, but the greatest potential for growth is going to be in middle income countries. There is a projected investment of about $19 trillion. It's about 2.6 times what is needed in terms of demand projected by 2030. And in the case of power, it's where the highest demand is going to be projected. And right now it's about $12 trillion that are projected for 2030. You might need 3.3 times of that in demand projected. So all of that to say that there's going to be a strong pressure over systems all throughout the world for increased investment. So with that as a backdrop, and it's very similar in line with what Jeff was saying about a hydropower development in the future years. This is a case from a different perspective. So Jeff made the case in terms of how you can increase balance and trade-offs and have a better outcome through trade-offs, through system scale planning. But if you look at system scale planning through risks, there are a lot of other benefits that could be brought by doing this kind of a broad landscape assessment. Usually when you go at the project level, you deal with the risks under a sponsor's control. And that's mainly what it's left from developing countries, passed as a risk to private developers, and they're the ones that need to deal with. This happens all throughout, not only for hydropower, it happens for energy development, it happens for mining across the world. A private developer gets a concession, and then they have to deal with the risks that are inherent to the project itself. It's at the project level, and then all the other factors, that are at landscape level, that will kick in afterwards once you're trying to develop a project, will be left to the project developer to actually deal with. And the government is usually stepping back from that. So, but that in reality, what brings is a lot of delays, a lot of problems with natural resources projects being developed in the developing world. What system scale planning does is it looks at the whole package of risks, not only at the risk at the project level, like constructional geological risk in the case of hydropower, but it also looks at other exogenous risks that are usually not looked at when you are dealing with a project at the project level. Like, for example, environmental and social issues, financing, political and regulatory. So it provides you an opportunity when you do early planning at the system scale, provides you an opportunity to look at holistically at the whole range of risks that a set of projects will have to deal with when being developed. And so it allows for each project, after as an outcome of that planning, when you have a portfolio of projects that are going to be delivered, it allows for all those portfolio of projects being part of the portfolio to have embedded already and vetted all those risks and have a balanced sort of package that you could put out there. So how can we bring those risks into being considered in early planning and use financial mechanisms that actually could deal with those and respond to those? So what we have done, and hope this looks fine, yes it does, is the following. We have been thinking of looking around the world, what are the project preparation facilities that exist around the world. And you find in the European Union, you have Jaspers, you have the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, IDB, IBRD, the World Bank. They all have project preparation facilities around the world. What is missing in those project preparation facilities is a portion of the resources going into upstream planning. So the majority of the project preparation facilities actually support projects at the single project level, but they are not supporting governments on doing early planning at system scale. So what we're thinking is, using the existing sort of frameworks and governance structures that exist around the world, how can we propose a financial mechanism, a financial tool that actually, and a model that could actually respond to that need for funding upstream planning. And let me run you through, what's the red?
Oh, the pointer?
Yeah.
The center circle. It didn't show up there. Try it there.
Shows
Yeah,
there.
it won't
Okay.
show up on that screen.
Great. So this is a planning facility. This planning facility would not only have funding, but also would provide capacity building, which is what happens all throughout the project preparation facilities that exist already. It will receive money from trust funds, mainly public funding, but could also receive money from project developers. And that's the beauty of it and the complication of it as well. So let me run you through how it works. This planning facility will identify a government interested in developing a landscape inventory assessment, which is mainly a system scale planning. You do an inventory of portfolio of projects in specific landscapes that you have identified. Based on that analysis, you identify a portfolio of projects. And each of those projects will run a preliminary feasibility study, an EIA cost, and PPAs, permits, and concessions. So you will then develop a package of financial and sort of managerial tools that will be embedded into each of those projects, ready to be auctioned. So then you run through the auction process, and you auction all these packages to private developers who will pay for those concessions with an additional fee to cover the cost of doing this and a portion of this package, of this work. That money will go back to the repairing facility to actually generate a revolving fund to allow for further investment in other countries on doing this kind of work and then throughout. This is something that we are exploring currently with the Inter-American Development Bank. We have agreed with the Ministry of Energy of Mexico to run through a process to explore this kind of approach, and based on that, reflect on how that approach could actually be developed into an actual facility. So IDB doesn't have a facility like this, but they would like to pilot it in a government, with a government, to see how it works, and based on that, reflect on how to design a facility like this. And what I wanted to reflect is the following. I'm talking about the Mekong, and we had a look at this, but also we have been in touch with the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, to discuss a facility that they already have in place, the Asia Pacific Project Preparation Facility, AP3F. This is a $33 million facility with money coming from mainly Japan, Australia, and a couple of other governments, plus the ADB. It just started. It's operational since the beginning of this year. They are still in the phase of, getting expression of interest from different governments to see what governments would like to do. It's open for any kind of infrastructure. However, interestingly enough, they have about 60% of all the expression of interest are coming from the transport sector, and they only have 2 projects for the power sector in Asia. So it's interesting that there is a lot of room to grow in terms of power. The areas of support are capacity building, project preparation, project monitoring, and project restructuring. And different to other facilities around the world, they are focusing. I would like to just highlight these last 2 areas of support: monitoring and restructuring. Those are areas that other facilities around the world usually don't focus on. They actually focus on the project preparation. They put the money, the project is there, and then voila, forget about it. In the case of the ADB, they claim that they're also going to be looking and supporting governments on monitoring and restructuring of existing projects. So that is something to look at. Now, the types of activities that they are supporting currently, or they're looking to support, are upstream sector reform, which is mainly looking into regulatory reform, due diligence of the project itself at the project level, single projects, preparation of information memoranda, that it's all the documents that you need to actually sell, attract the interest of private investors, and then strong project documentation and financial models are the additional information that once you identify a potential investor, then you need to go through the specifics documents for putting the project out there and private investors to invest in it. When we talked with them yesterday about this, they mentioned that they would see areas of growth such as, for example, including early planning and stakeholder engagement upstream, looking into cumulative environmental and social impacts, and looking into project siting at landscape scale. At this point, the facility itself, it's very flexible in terms of allowing for these kind of approaches, but they haven't received any expression of interest from specific countries to do so, and certainly they haven't looked into this so far. They're mainly focused at the project level, single projects. So we wanted just to bring this example of the AP3F, first of all, because it's relevant to the region that we're talking about. Second of all, because it's a very flexible tool, at least that's a claim that is coming from ADB. And third of all, based on what we discussed and Jeff has presented, and also this idea of the early planning facility that I just shared with you, we believe that there is a lot of room for growth for this facility, particularly to look into this kind of approaches, identify countries that would be willing to look into this, and then promote this kind of approaches with countries so countries could access this facility, could access those resources, both in terms of financial resources and capacity support, to be able to develop this kind of system scale planning efforts. So I'll stop there. Happy to take on questions, and certainly all of this, but both what Jeff mentioned and I just mentioned are complementary. We're looking into ways in which not only the technical piece goes into a country, but also lead with some financial mechanisms and capacity building support to make that happen. Always hoping for political will and political leadership in the country that it's, or the region that is interested in taking on this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, both of you, very much, and so we're open to questions. I have one, but I'll defer to the audience right now. I shouldn't say defer to the participants because we are a participatory roundtable type meeting here. So weigh in, please. Carl Jackson again.
I was in Myanmar last week talking to people, oddly enough, about some hydro-related things. And what I was struck by was, they need 500 megawatts per year of new energy this year, next year, the year after. And the compelling thing is obviously politics. If the lights start going out in Yangon, it's over. Politically, it'll be a terrible blow for the new regime. So, I stipulate everything you've said makes a great deal of sense. How quickly could you put this in operation? Because time is money in politics.
Well, I'll just give a short response. From the Nature Conservancy's perspective, we just went through the process of approving a new geography. And in fact, all the work that we did preceded that. So we didn't have a country program, we don't have staff. We worked with local NGOs who were able to provide us the local contacts and help us set up workshops and all that. So we're very, very new. But this will be one of the two things that we focus on. As the Nature Conservancy goes into Myanmar, we will be focused on forest issues and river conservation, hydropower planning. I do think that we're looking for ways to engage with the IFC. IFC is developing a strategic environmental assessment for hydropower development in the country. And for example, one option is perhaps we could serve on the advisory group to that process, to be helping to shape what are the studies that are being done that are going to guide the recommendations from that study for energy development. But I think that we are still learning the landscape in terms of players, decision makers, and recognizing that the whole time that we were working there, everything was in transition. So we were meeting with agencies of people that didn't even know if they were going to still have an agency with that name, or if, what was going to happen during the transition. And in fact, there already has been some combinations and shuffling of agencies. So I think we're going to move as quickly as we can, but we have a steep learning curve in terms of the institutions and how that new government is taking shape and how we can build something to try to influence it.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think beyond just overcoming and getting to know the landscape.
Actually, Amy, had a question.
Oh.
No, just say who you are.
Hi, I'm Amy Usak, Assistant Director with our Great Rivers Program at the Nature Conservancy. The point I want to make is, and this is laid out in the sort of latter part of our report, is that there are short, medium, and long-term tiers of activities that you could do to actually get this on the ground. And so one of the short-term ones being that this happened rather quickly and it was illustrative, but if we were to be able to work with the relevant agencies, you can identify low-hanging fruit projects quite quickly by just doing, some, binary features or objectives like environmental and social. Don't put dams in areas where there's social unrest, for example. So there are some short-term things and activities that you can do in applying it, and then more long-term with our partners at Manchester, they're working in Kenya over, I think it's a 5-year plan to do stakeholder analysis. So we're actually going through with agency by agency to do the 2-tier objective conversation to actually identify what development scenario is most optimal for their interest. And doing that, eventually building out the stakeholders that are involved in that process to identify what is the optimal development scenario for all those stakeholders, all those agencies who have interest in that basin. So I think there's a range of things that you can do from short to long term that we could be involved in.
Julian.
Good morning, Julian Cashnoff with States Waters. First off, thanks for the presentation and for the report. I mentioned to Amy when I saw it earlier that I thought it was mandatory reading for folks that are interested in basin sustainability and water politics and the whole range of issues that you covered, so I appreciate it, even if it is just illustrative. I guess a quick question just in terms of the reception that this report has gotten, both in terms of your target audience in Myanmar, but also, I'm sort of curious, stakeholders within sort of your TNC network. Is this a departure from the kind of work that you've done before? Is it a hard sell to sort of put development first? And sort of
Don't forget the kale.
Where do you see
No, I think that I'll have Amy respond more about the reaction within Myanmar, but we've gotten fairly good response from our internal or our close colleagues, close partners, collaborators in this endeavor. And I think it's because we've had a series of iterations of this. We've collaborated with the IDB and produced a report. We did the Power of Rivers. Now we're working on this. And I think there's a trajectory, and people realize that we're trying to solve a problem, and we're trying to, they see where we're trying to go, and we're trying to figure out what are the components that need to be there to solve it. And Jorge's been exploring the actual mechanisms to do it. So I think people recognize that all that we're doing is consistent with the mission of the Nature Conservancy. I mean, we are trying to figure out how to get better solutions for rivers, better solutions for the people that depend on healthy rivers. And that is what drives the work. And I think that we're able to make that case, even if we talk about a planning framework that is really focused on development outcomes for a country. So that's one thing. So Amy, do you want to talk a bit about how people were receiving it? You were involved in the workshops and with stakeholders and agencies. So
yeah. So we had 2 separate workshops. One was with government agencies from irrigation, navigation, fisheries, environment, power, agriculture, and then we had another one which was focusing on civil society organizations. And the civil society organization had a sort of a cautious approval of the approach. I think the major feedback we got from civil society is that one is, the real drivers and the people that are going to be creating demand for this is going to be in the government, so that's largely who we should focus on. But also, their question was, what kind of product does this give to the people of Myanmar? Given the new democratic political system, they have an opportunity to have a voice, as they have with Myanmar its own as an example, but they, I think, even more so now, without having fear of the government, applying severe repercussions for that. And so I think what this does is it can create a variety of scenarios on what the options are for better development at their interest, and it gives them that piece of material, that product, to go to the government and say, you're developing like this, but look what you could be doing to actually be protecting my interests. And so I think that's a step that we need to take to actually create more of a demand and a better reception for this in the country. And then I'll just say quickly that in the government workshop, it was fascinating to see, and there was positive reception and feedback from the representative of the ministries for there to be collaboration to work together to come to a development goal and a development objective. The challenge that they gave back to us was who was actually going to be the governing body to institute that and facilitate that engagement. There was a water resource commission that was developing, and I think just a couple months ago dissolved. But that had, and when we brought up that as a possible solution, they all sort of laughed, like actually laughed. So, so that is still a question to be solved. Is, you know, it's probably not the Nature Conservancy to do this. Is there a ministry that should be doing it? Is it something like the MRC? So that was another feedback we got.
Yeah, if I could say that quickly. So the question, there's two, is there any country in the world that's has as much potential, hydro potential as Myanmar, that is so far behind the curve in actually developing it? In other words, it does seem there's a real opportunity here. It's sort of still the ground floor in a lot of ways. And the other is, and you alluded to this, you know, for the Nature Conservancy and others to develop the concept, this can be carried out by other more technically deep organizations, right? Or either agencies, consultants, whatever.
Yeah, I think for your second question, I certainly think that could be the case, but you know, it needs to be, I think, not just some technical institution, but somebody who is locally very conscientious and aware of the political climate that's there.
Okay.
And then the other challenge we got is, at what scale do you execute this kind of planning? The challenges become more severe the greater the scale.
Thanks. We have a question here? Yeah.
Yeah, Terry Dunmeyer, thank you. That was a really useful and effective presentation. And the question I would have would be, from this side of the equation and the development side of the equation, makes an enormous amount of sense. I wonder how, on the flip side of it, building on what you were just talking about, the capability housed inside, whether it's an enabling agency or a planning agency, how does one build that capability so this tool can actually be used effectively, so that when developers and financial institutions and organizations such as the Nature Conservancy go in to review projects, they actually can have a productive conversation rather than someone nodding politely, pretending they know what you're talking about. Because this is a relatively sophisticated tool. So is there any sort of step in that direction that is being taken?
Yeah, not that I had seen when I was there, because the NWRC was the closest, I think, to that body that you're referring to. And I'm actually not sure what the political reasons were for it to be dissolved.
All the commissions were dissolved on the last day that Thein Sein was in office, and so it's not just you.
Right, it was a clear, they just cleared the field there. Is this something, and I'm just curious, I mean, is this something that an AID, is this something that could be done in training? I mean, I know I did that for several countries through AID in Africa. So I'm wondering whether or not this might be a project in collaboration, because I'm sure this set of algorithms requires, you know, a fair amount of expertise and precision. And my experience in Myanmar was that kind of expertise it's there, but it's dispersed. And so if you're really lucky, you get somebody inside who knows what they can do. And it would be a shame to lose the effectiveness, if you will, of this. So I don't know, it would be.
Can I broaden the question too, and to say, you know, it sounds like you guys have, particularly with this early planning facility, it's almost like there's a strategy that's being implemented to protect sort of free-flowing rivers or a certain number globally, right, that you guys are working on. I'm curious sort of the different components that are falling into place. What is missing in the region for your vision to sort of start to make its way onto the ground? I mean, what are the components that you really are worried about, or that you really need to be able to get it to move forward?
I think
That-
to answer,
generally
to answer both those questions, I think and Amy posited this, that there's short term, medium term, and long term. Short term, there are these investments going in from IFC, World Bank, JICA. So there's a chance for groups like the Nature Conservancy and WWF and DFID and others to be influencing how those major investments and studies play out. Now, the risk is that those just produce studies. They're studies with recommendations. They don't have any force. What Jorge is describing is how to link a set of investors so that have money to go into projects to reinforce the kinds of recommendations or processes that would be supported by those studies. So maybe that's the studies are the short term, and there's already money going in. Developing a financial mechanism to support the kinds of projects that emerge from those studies might be a medium term. And then long term is what are the regulations? What does Myanmar have in terms of a regulatory structure for planning, licensing, mitigation, other investments? And I think really for this to be durable over the long term, there needs to be a regulatory structure that supports this. So and the planning and licensing, and there's examples around the world of how that can be done. So that would be the long term. So I think that's what's needed, is to move from the short-term opportunities to influence the studies, get the momentum going in the right direction, then align the financial investments to support that, then align the regulatory structure.
If I could just, but sitting on the investment side of the equation, what is very difficult is when one has meetings with the requisite ministries and they have no idea what language you're speaking technically. And this is a really, really valuable tool. And so how does that symmetry of knowledge, how can that be put in place in your short term?
Yeah, you're talking about some kind of introductory capacity building?
Exactly,
So that's-
exactly, because if you put that in the long term, it's over, in my opinion. Money will move on, and money will move on. So that would, I think, have to be almost tied to transfer of the knowledge, so that you actually have people who can learn and implement as you go forward into stages 2 and 3.
What we've experienced is that there's a bit of a catch-22 here, because there are a couple of agencies, such as IFC, in the case of Myanmar, IFC, Asian Development Bank, even the World Bank, IBRD, that are interested in doing that, in sort of looking for ways in which they can enhance the capacity of agencies from the new government, but they are very much in service of those governments. So those governments need to ask for it. And if governments do not express interest on doing that, then these agencies will not move. And that's what they actually claim. And I've seen that so many times. I used to work at the World Bank, so I've seen that firsthand. Usually these agencies are just reacting to what governments ask. And if governments are not progressive, then these agencies will not move. So it's a catch-22. Because you need to find ways in which you can, with the right partners, probably not the Nature Conservancy would do it directly, but with the right partners, Stimson or other local political savvy institutions in Myanmar, on the ground, in Yangon, in Naypyidaw, that they could actually talk to the right people in government agencies to tell them, hey guys, you need to be looking into this. And then they signal that to state, to USAID, to Asia Development Bank. That is the catch-22. And certainly we are looking into, for us as TNC, not having this is a question that was posed to TNC, so I'll ask as TNC. For us, not having an offices on the ground in Yangon at this point doesn't allow us to have a lot of influence on, or a lot of opportunities to engage with local politically savvy institutions that could do that with government agencies. So what we're doing so far is trying to engage with ADB, IBRD, USAID, state, IFC, to try to tell them, hey guys, this is here. When you talk with the government, just tell them that this exists, so they might feel compelled to actually ask for this kind of support.
But
not to purchase, and this is just to be straight, not to purchase TNC services or our tools, but just the approach in itself, and the value of it.
We should, but along those lines, I think all of us shouldn't forget the power of ideas as part of this. So it needs discussion. It needs to be in the media. It needs to be in the literature, but particularly the stuff that the decision makers would actually read, or AE, or at a ministry level, people would actually pay attention to this and get this idea going. It's a great idea, and but it's just at a takeoff point, right?
Do people think that the emergence of the NLD represents perhaps a unique opportunity for government-driven demand? They're in a position, I think, of acknowledging that they have a lot of learning to do, a lot of new processes to establish, a new regulatory to establish. So perhaps this is a moment in time where they really would be open, so government-driven demand for this is a real possibility, because they're not locked in their ways.
Well, and just quickly, where else again to talk about the potential, hydropower potential, and how far behind the curve they are, if you will. What other government do we know of that is in this position to actually think about something more strategically? It's not already locked in by
Gabon.
By all the stakeholders.
Gabon, Nepal.
Okay. Henry,
Yeah, I just have a suggestion. I think for PNC, I think in terms of government agency in Myanmar, I think it's the DWIR. Have you guys talked to them? I think it's the Division of, or Department of Water and Irrigation Resources. They currently, the water sector is managed by many agencies in Myanmar, so that's one of the problems. But I think it's being consolidated, and I think Dr. Nini is under DWIR, and she's dubbed as the water queen of Myanmar. But that agency is leading a World Bank fund that is actually a loan, $100 million project called the Integrated or Sustainable Development and Management of the Irrawaddy. It's easier to pronounce Irrawaddy than the other one, something like that. So you talk to them. Currently, I have actually some of my MRC colleagues are working as experts in that project. The focus is, in addition to capacity building, the focus is hydropower, obviously, navigation, food security, that's include fisheries and irrigation, and flood risk mitigation. And then capacity building is one of the components. And so you talk to them. I know because I did apply to their project coordination advisor. I'm still waiting. I don't think I'll get it. I haven't heard from them, but yeah, I think you can start with them, at least in the short term.
We worked quite a bit with Nini.
There you go.
So,
you work what?
the water.
Sorry?
Nini Tien, she's a prominent leader in the water management world in Myanmar.
One footnote,
Yes.
you gotta add corruption. As the 11th.
Add or subtract?
Uh,
Factor in.
I was in the Director General for Hydropower Generation Implementation with a long title. Office last week, and there were, I'd say, 12 people in the waiting room. I was the only non-Mandarin speaker.
Wow, yeah. Wow, that's a good point to close the meeting with a really thoughtful, provocative idea. Go ahead.
Can I make one last comment?
Yeah.
Because on behalf of the
Sure.
National River Commission, I think that you did mention, Richard, in your introduction that MRC is not quite working.
Yeah.
Let me see. It could be a lot better.
Yeah.
They're trying their best. It's a secretariat, so they're trying to facilitate
Right.
hydro diplomacy within the region. In terms of one of the objectives of hydro diplomacy is sustainable development management of water resources in a river basin, especially transboundary waters. And yes, they're not doing very well in that respect. But the other unspoken objective of hydro diplomacy is keeping the peace and good development of four countries, and I think they're doing very well. Serving as the punching bag of the countries. Instead of the country blaming another country, they blame the Secretary of Basic.
Indirectly, we've always, at Stimson, and this is our so-called Mekong Policy Project, or not so-called, what we call it. We've always emphasized that the MRC, whatever its limitations, is still the only game in town. There'll never be another treaty like the 1995 treaty. There's no way to start with a clean slate again, page again. And we've also emphasized regional relationships and peace and stability in the region. And that's another angle, though, to get at this issue. That is in Myanmar. I mean, in the Mekong Basin, not necessarily in Myanmar, but although you have sub-national elements to Myanmar as well. But that's, in a way, that diplomatic, political, even security, strategic aspect of this is, and this is something we're trying to work on, particularly with Vietnamese. So you guys got to step out. You guys got to get engaged with your leader, with your neighbors. This is, they understand how important it is. They're panicked about the Delta, but at the same time, the diplomacy, the regional politics, et cetera, is something that's not happening not going very well. Well, thank you, everyone. Extremely stimulating discussion, one of the best we've had, I would say, of this roundtable nature. And so, Jeff, Jorge, Amy, all of you come. Please, and commented and raised questions, please. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay tuned. We hope to be doing more of this, and we know they will be doing more of this, and we may be able to do some of it with them in one way or another. Probably more at the issue of the power of ideas and also stuff like that, capacity building. Okay, thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.